All right, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. I am thrilled to have, I don't want to say an old friend because we don't want to characterize our ages, but he's a longtime friend. And it is Charles Rice-Gonzales, a writer, co-founder of BAD, the Bronx Academy of Arts and Dance, and, as I said, a friend of Gary Axelbank for many years. Nice to see you, Charles.
It's great to be here. Great to see you too, Gary.
Let's just, before we get into the short story, which, as I told you just before, I just was moved by tremendously. Just talk about your writing. What kinds of things do you look to write about? And then ultimately for this, why did that feed into kind of your agenda, if you will, or what your passion is?
Yeah. I think one of the things, there's a phrase like write what you know. And so I love the idea of writing what you know and things that I know are the Bronx, things that I know of myself, growing up in the Bronx, Puerto Rican, queer, person of color. And so I like writing about those ideas or those themes, those things. Also, growing up in the time, really part of my own activism, my love of art. So the things I like to write about stem from those things. So I've written a novel that's called Chulito, that's about a young queer kid coming out in Hunts Point, and that's been almost 10 years ago that book came out. But many of the stories spring from this place, spring from the Bronx, spring from the Bronx is always in there in some way, shape, or form. Um, and part of that is because I was inspired by many other writers, particularly Abraham Rodriguez, the first time I read one of his books, and was able to see the Bronx so vividly portrayed. And I was familiar with the streets and everything. So it was just so much fun to read. So I said I was inspired to do that as well. So I
I
very
always
often, go ahead.
go ahead. You wanted to finish that? Go ahead.
Well, just I very often make sure that the Bronx, whether it's front and center or there is some way I bring the Bronx into the conversation.
Well, you're preaching to me, I'm preaching to the choir. I mean, to me, everything has the Bronx in it, so you don't have to go too far. Um, but uh, I'm always interested in this, not only about a writer's muse, but how much of yourself is documented in there, or is in this particular story, and I don't want to hold people in suspense anymore, but in this particular story, is it somewhat biographical without you using your own name, or is it something that you kind of fantasized, if you will, about what could be?
Well, Deep Salvage is fiction. It's a fiction
It's
story.
full
I'm not
fiction.
the main character or the supporting character in there. But in many ways, writers may say this, but I'll just say this for myself as a writer. I'm braided into all of these, right? And then the people around me are braided into them. Very often, I
Yes.
get inspired by a person or a particular, and the character becomes a collage of different people. But this story in particular grew from my it was a challenge. I had gone to a conference, and it was a LGBTQ conference for writers in New Orleans called Saints and Sinners. And there was a very famous writer, and he said there was a time when all queer writers were writing about was AIDS, and that since that changed, that what would stories about HIV or AIDS look like now? And so that stuck with me. And that was like 10 years ago, I think, maybe, that he made that challenge to the room. And so I was thinking about it, but I also thought a lot about my own history here in the Bronx. And so sometimes there's a section in there, there's a roll call of names of different people.
Yes.
And some of those were actual people that I,
Uh,
did a lot of activism for. So
the first sentence captured me and engaged me and made me think as a heterosexual man in the Bronx. And I'm going to say it. I didn't think people died of AIDS anymore.
mhm.
Whoa. And so then you knew you were into something that people don't talk about. And I'm just going to tell you what my impression of the entire thing, because it's a tremendous romance. It gets into the relationships between people, why they get together, the walls between them, and then what binds them, and then yeah, I mean, I'm telling you what I picked out of it. Um, but what I was not aware of until really I read this, so you were successful, is the level to which HIV affected and still apparently affects uh, gay people's relationships with each other. That
Mhm.
you can have this relationship, but there is that undercurrent that you can't control to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, like I talk about people in the story, that in a way, I often use a phrase that there are a lot of ghosts sometimes inside of the stories, right? Not
Yes.
necessarily literally, but they are people or experiences that kind of live there in a phantom like way. And in a way, there is we're in a different time with HIV and AIDS. I mean, there was in the 80s and 90s, it was like fatal.
It
you
was
know,
it was an epidemic, a pandemic, if you will. I mean, I don't know what
it's-
the level is, but
Mhm.
it was horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in a way, it casts a long shadow. And so we're in a different time right now, but there are certain conditions which I learned about. That the term deep salvage was that sometimes people for different reasons become resistant to the drugs, and it's almost like 1992, or the 80s and 90s for them. And so luckily today there's constantly advances. So I think deep salvage will be something of the past, and hopefully at some point so will
Right.
HIV and AIDS. But it's still, it's kind of like the haunting that it does to relationships. And so so even still, so I felt like that. And I'm glad you said it was a romance, because that's what it is.
Oh,
Ultimately
there's
it's one
no
of those.
question about it in my
Yeah.
mind. Yeah, of
Mhm.
course. And but it's a and it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight or whatever the heck you are. There's when you meet, especially you meet somebody in the Bronx. Let's use the Bronx. You meet somebody there. You don't know how close to get. You don't know if it's working. You don't know if it's the real love that you want. Yet
Mhm.
you're attracted, and of course, there's a sexual attract. I mean, it just played with all that, and then somewhere toward the end, it comes up that, oh, by the way, you have an HIV problem, but your HIV problem is also my HIV problem.
Yeah.
In other words, and that was very striking because you don't think about it now. Maybe, like you said, 1992, everybody
Mhm.
was aware of it, but you may not be aware of it now. I mean, I just really thought it was interesting. We should mention The Big Other, right? The Big Other is an online journal of Puerto Rican writers. Do you want to just talk about that and why this is appropriate for that
Mhm.
online publication?
Well, the Big Other, well, I'm going to say three things maybe about it. The Big Other
Okay.
is not specifically only Puerto Rican. They did a special Puerto Rican folio. So they curated a bunch of Puerto Rican writers, which was wonderful. I was glad that to be a part of that opportunity. But they published all kinds of things, from poetry to fiction, and some of the things on the online journal have won awards, and many award-winning writers have contributed to it. So I was very glad that that the piece I submitted was accepted. I was also really glad because the piece is kind of one of the longer ends of short stories, and that's one of the things I run into, is that a lot of times in print it becomes difficult because my stories tend to be a little longer than the average short story, which could be about 15 pages is a sweet spot for a short story. This one I think
It's
is
a little
about,
longer. That's right. It's
yeah,
26
it's
pages. I have
26
it
pages.
right here in front of me.
So there are places that would publish that, but there's much less. And so far, the online environment provides an opportunity for longer works that are in this kind of in between place. So I was glad for that. And so the Big Other has really been doing a lot to promote the series of writers. And there's some great writers in the folio. There's Willie Perdomo's in it. There's Caridad, that's from the Bronx, is in it. There's Edwin Torres, another poet who's from the Bronx, that's in it. So I feel the Bronx is well represented in the group of writers that are a part of this folio.
You know what I do for a living? I'm always conscious of presenting a program for an audience, and my audience, of course, is the Bronx. I'm always interested in writers who write. Did you think about, well, I'm going to write this for gay people, or I'm going to write this for straight people, or I'm going to like, did you have an audience in mind, or did you just say to yourself, I'm writing a story, whoever reads it, that's fine? Or did you say,
Mhm.
this is something I wanted to, in a way, a gift to give to somebody? Yeah, I don't mean a person, but did you
Mhm.
have an audience in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? I think I'm thinking specifically. I was thinking of like, well, there's not, believe it or not, there's not like tons of queer, particularly queer male relationship stories, right? That are
Yes,
stories about
that's totally true.
relationships. And so for me, I'm interested in that. So there is that perspective, but as you have noticed or picked up, yeah, it's like the whole idea of meeting, of falling in love, of being attracted, of I love that you said like your HIV is my HIV, right? So in a sense, in a relationship, that's what it is, right? People come together and they just make a decision to share their lives with one another. And I think a lot of times there could be still, a lot of presuppositions or assumptions, I want to say, about
Mhm.
queer relationships. And I think I'm finding that it's even becoming more urgent for me to continue writing and do more writing because, look, our current country right now, there's all these don't say gay bills.
I was just going to say that there are real problems out there. It's almost like we're going backwards, which blows my mind.
Yeah. And so, since that is kind of the activity that's happening, I think it's important for artists, for leaders to continue creating more because we should fight for queer issues to be in schools and taught in schools. But that's not the only place where we can teach them. They can learn through literature, they can learn through the arts, they can learn through community. There's lots of different ways to do it. And so, for me, as you know, I run a space called BAD. And so we do it there and I do it through writing and through some of my involvement in different organizations to continue um, just creating possibilities for how queer people can live and love in America.
While queer people might, identify with this and all that, I do think that there was a sense of normalizing these relationships and saying these are just the same relationships that everybody has, with all the details, with all the
Mhm.
nuances. You're a very detailed writer. I mean, I know you see the world like that because you know what's going on in those little spaces. So let's just wrap it up. Deep Salvage. How do people read it? They can see it on The Big Other, I guess, is where. And then, of
Yeah,
course, what's next, Charles? We're sitting at the edge of our seat waiting for you to get done with whatever you're working on.
that's great. Thank you. Well, yeah, it's great. The Big Other, you can get it. What I love about online publication is that it's free. And I posted it, and many people have read it. So please check out not only my story, but all the works on The Big Other. And it's literally that thebigodher.com, and you can find these stories in there. You can search for them, or just
Great,
Google my name and my story, and it'll come up, and then you can explore everything else.
great.
Next, so I mentioned that I wrote a novel called Chulito,
We've got about
and
25 seconds, so go ahead.
yeah, and so I'm working to get another novel published. I've already written it called Hunts Point, which is a follow
Oh,
up to that. It's a full novel, and Hunts Point is the neighborhood in which it's featured.
and guess what? As soon as it's out, you'll be here. We're going to invite you again.
Thank you.
Charles, always a pleasure, my friend. And thanks for the great work. I mean, talking about our people, talking about people of the Bronx in detailed ways, in personal ways, is so badly needed. And we appreciate you doing that.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Always a pleasure and honor.
So that's going to do it. We thank Dave Colon from Streets Blog for the first segment. We thank our buddy Charles Rice-Gonzales. And guess what's going to happen? We'll see you next week. Good night.